The night Lenora Keller walked into the Caldwell Springs town social, every head in the room turned, and every man pressed forward. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in the Kansas Territory, where the grasslands rolled out like a golden ocean, and the wind never quite stopped moving. Caldwell Springs had grown up fast around the cattle trails, the kind of town where saloons and churches stood side by side and nobody found that strange. The social was held in the freshly painted community hall on the second Saturday of October, the boards still smelling of pine sap, and the lanterns burning bright enough to throw warm orange light across the faces of every homesteader, rancher, shopkeeper, and cowboy who had ridden in from miles around. Lenora had driven herself in her father's wagon, which was unusual enough to earn a few raised eyebrows from the older women sitting near the punch bowl. Her father, Wilhelm Keller, was 3 weeks into a bad chest cold and had insisted she go without him. He was a German immigrant who had brought his family to Kansas 7 years prior, built a modest wheat farm on the eastern edge of the valley, and raised his daughter to be capable, self-reliant, and kind. Lenora was 24 years old, with dark brown hair pinned carefully at the back of her neck, a blue calico dress that had been let out and taken in more times than she could count, and eyes the color of creek water on a cloudy day, not quite green, not quite gray, but something honest in between. She stepped through the door with a covered dish of apple cake balanced in both hands, and that was when the press of bodies began. The hall was crowded. Men who spent their weeks in open fields and silent ranges seemed to shrink themselves down when brought indoors together, and yet somehow they still managed to fill every inch of available space near the entrance. Several of them stepped toward her at once, hands reaching to take her dish, voices overlapping with greetings and how-do-you-dos and compliments on her dress. It was not malicious. Most of them were lonely. Most of them were well-meaning. But the combined effect of 8 or 9 men converging at once was a wall of wool coats and boot leather, and Lenora felt the air press out of the room. She smiled because she had been raised to smile, but her fingers tightened on the ceramic dish, and she angled her shoulders slightly inward the way a person does when they need a moment but are too polite to ask for one. That was when the crowd shifted. The shift came from the back of the cluster, where the largest man in the room was standing. He was tall enough that Lenora had noticed him before she even reached the door, a full head above most of the other men, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from years of physical work and not from any kind of vanity. He was wearing a dark brown coat over a clean linen shirt, and his hat was already in his hands, which she would later remember as the detail that first caught her attention. Most men kept their hats on indoors until someone told them to take them off. This one had already done it. He saw her. He saw the tightness in her shoulders and the way her smile did not quite reach her eyes, and without saying a single word to the men around him, without making any kind of announcement, he simply took a step back, and then another. And then he turned slightly to the man beside him and said something quiet, and that man stepped back too, and slowly, like a river finding its natural course, the crowd opened up just enough. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Not a dramatic parting of the sea. Just enough room for Lenora to breathe, to bring her dish to the table along the wall, and to set it down without being jostled. She turned around and looked for the man who had done it. He was already across the room, talking to Harlan Briggs, the grain merchant, hat still in his hands, expression easy and unhurried. He did not look at her. He had not done it for her attention. He had simply done it because it was the right thing to do, and apparently that was the end of it for him. Lenora Keller did not forget it. Her name on the social register was noted by Mrs. Pauline Greer, who ran the register table and made it her personal mission to know the marital status of every person in a 20-mile radius. Pauline was round-faced and quick-smiled and about as subtle as a cattle stampede. "Lenora, dear, you look lovely. Is your father feeling better? And have you met Dexter Carson? He has the cattle operation out past Miller's Creek. Came up from Texas 2 years ago. Very steady man, very responsible. Lenora accepted a cup of punch and glanced in the direction Pauline was nodding, the large man with the brown coat. Of course. I have not had the pleasure, Lenora said. Well, Pauline's eyes lit up. Let me correct that immediately. Lenora was halfway through composing a polite protest when Pauline had already sailed across the room with all the momentum of a woman who considered herself a force of nature in good causes. Lenora watched her tap Dexter Carson on the arm, saw him turn, and then watched the unmistakable sequence of Pauline pointing back at Lenora while talking at considerable speed. He did not react with visible enthusiasm or with false indifference. He simply listened, nodded once, said something to Harlan Briggs by way of excusing himself, and walked across the room. He was, she noted as he approached, genuinely large. Not in any threatening sense, but in the way of a person who had simply been built on a larger scale than average, the kind of person who had to be careful in doorways and who probably could not buy boots from any general store in the territory. He had dark hair with some early gray coming in at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something honest and direct. She put him at about 31 or 32. His eyes were brown and steady, and they looked at her with the straightforward attention of a man who had decided to be present in the moment he was in. "Miss Keller," he said, and extended his hand. "Dexter Carson, I apologize for Mrs. Greer. She is an enthusiastic woman." Lenora shook his hand. His grip was careful, controlled, like a man who knew his own strength and was deliberate about not using all of it. "She means well," Lenora said. "I believe she means to have half of Caldwell Springs married off before winter," he said. Lenora laughed, and it was a real laugh, not a social one. "Then she has her work cut out for her. My father has been warning me for 3 years that this was coming. Smart man, your father. He grows wheat and reads Goethe in the evenings. He is the cleverest man I know." Something moved in Dexter's expression, a kind of recognition or appreciation that was not easy to fake. "Goethe," he repeated. "That is not what I expected to hear in Caldwell Springs on a Saturday night. What did you expect? Bible verses and cattle prices." "Oh, we do plenty of those too," Lenora said. "He does them in German, which confuses the cattle considerably." He smiled then, and it changed his face entirely. The steadiness did not go away, but it opened up, became warmer, the way a window lets in light without losing its frame. They stood at the edge of the room and talked through 2 dances they did not dance, and 1 song performed badly by the Wilson boys on fiddle and jaw harp. Lenora learned that Dexter had come from San Antonio 2 years prior with a small herd, and a land claim he had worked through a good deal of difficulty to secure. She learned that he had a younger brother named Cal who was 20 years old and living with him on the ranch, and who was, in Dexter's description, a capable hand and a consistent source of chaos. He learned that Lenora had come from Frankfurt at age 17 with her parents and 2 younger sisters, that she had helped build the farmhouse with her own hands, that she could read English, German, and a functional amount of French from a book she had found in a box of donated goods at the church, and that she had opinions about land management and crop rotation that were more informed than most of the men in the room would ever suspect. He did not find any of this alarming. That, Lenora noted, was also unusual. When the fiddle players took a break and the caller announced a Virginia reel, Dexter looked at her with a direct and simple expression and said, "Would you like to dance, Miss Keller? I should warn you that I am a competent dancer, but a large one, and I have stepped on toes before." "I have sturdy boots," she said. He did not step on her toes. He was careful and deliberate, and moved with more grace than his size suggested. And when he put his hand at her back to guide her through the pattern of the reel, it was light and respectful, and nothing more than what the dance required. Afterward he brought her a second cup of punch, and they stood together near the far wall while the room swirled around them, and the conversation continued like it had never stopped, easy and genuine, and with a quality that Lenora recognized as rare. It felt like talking to someone who was actually listening. When the social ended at 9:30 and the lanterns were being turned down, Dexter walked her to her wagon. The night was cold and clear, the kind of Kansas sky that feels like the stars have been pulled down a foot closer just to make the dark more beautiful. "Your father," he said, as she gathered the reins. "Is he being seen by anyone? Doc Prescott came out on Thursday. He said it's likely to break in another week. If there is anything that needs doing on the farm while he is down, I could send Cal. He is not always a source of chaos. Sometimes he is actually useful." It was an offer made without pretense, without the particular brand of performance that men sometimes employed when they wanted something in return. He was simply offering because there was a need and he had something to give. "That is very kind," Lenora said, "but we are managing." "I know you are," he said. "I only meant the offer is there." She looked at him in the starlight for a moment. He had his hat back on now and he was standing at the right distance, not too close, respectful without being cold. "Thank you, Mr. Carson," she said, "for earlier as well." He looked at her with a slight question in his expression. "When I came in," she said, "you stepped back, you gave me room." He seemed genuinely surprised that she had noticed or perhaps that she had brought it up. "That was nothing," he said. "It was not nothing," she said. "Good night, Mr. Carson." She clicked the reins and the horse moved forward, and she did not look back until she was at the edge of the field, and when she did, he was still standing there in the yellow light of the hall door, watching to make sure she made it to the road safely. She faced forward and smiled at the dark. The first time Dexter Carson rode out to the Keller farm, it was 11 days after the social, and he had a legitimate reason for being there. The Miller Creek Bridge had washed out in a hard rain the week before, and every farmer and rancher on the eastern side of the valley had been rerouting around the Keller property's southern edge, which meant an extra 2 hours on any drive to town. Dexter had organized a work crew to repair the bridge, and he had come to ask Wilhelm Keller if he was willing to contribute a day's labor when he was on his feet. Wilhelm Keller was 61 years old, still thin from the illness but sharp as a new nail, and he sat at the kitchen table with his large hands wrapped around a coffee cup and looked at Dexter Carson with the frank assessment of a man who had raised a daughter alone since his wife passed and had developed a very reliable instinct for character. "Sit down," Wilhelm said. "My daughter will bring coffee." Lenora, who had been in the back room sorting seed packets when she heard the knock, came into the kitchen and stopped when she saw who was sitting across from her father. She recovered herself in approximately 1 second, which she was proud of, and moved to the stove with the kind of controlled efficiency that comes from practice. "Mr. Carson," she said, "this is unexpected." "I apologize for the intrusion," Dexter said. "I have bridge business with your father." "Of course you do," she said, and handed him a cup of coffee. Wilhelm watched this exchange with the expression of a man reading a text in a language he knows very well. The bridge business was genuine and was discussed thoroughly. Wilhelm agreed to contribute 2 days of labor once he was strong enough, and he offered the use of his oxen as well, which was a significant contribution and which Dexter accepted with genuine gratitude. Then Wilhelm said, "You will stay for the noon meal." "I would not want to impose." "You will stay," Wilhelm said, in the tone of a man for whom this was not a question. Lenora, cutting bread at the counter, kept her eyes on the bread. Dexter stayed for the noon meal. It was a simple thing, bread and soup, and the last of the summer preserves. But it was made well, and the table was laid with care, and the conversation that happened across it was the kind that stretches a simple meal into something longer and more nourishing than the food itself. Wilhelm talked about Germany, about the farm country east of Frankfurt, about why he had decided to leave and bring his family to a country that was, in his estimation, both more dangerous and more full of possibility than anything he had encountered in Europe. He talked about his wife, Berta, who had died of fever 4 years after they arrived, and about how the land had felt different after that, smaller somehow, despite being objectively enormous. Dexter listened with the quality that Lenora had noticed at the social, real attention, not performed attention. He asked good questions. He did not try to match the story with his own stories immediately, which was the habit of a man who was more interested in being heard than in hearing. "And you," Wilhelm said eventually, in the direct way he had that sometimes caught people off guard, "you came from Texas. Why Kansas? Land was cheaper here 2 years ago, and the grass." I had heard about the bluestem grass in the Kansas hills, and I wanted to see if it was true. "And was it?" "Better than described," Dexter said. Wilhelm nodded as though this was the right answer. "A man who moves for grass," he said. "That is a man who knows what matters." After the meal, Dexter helped carry the dishes to the sink, which made Lenora turn and look at him with an expression she could not quite smooth away in time. He caught it and almost smiled. "I have a younger brother," he said by way of explanation. "I raised him after our mother passed. I know what dishes look like." "How old were you?" Lenora asked. 22. He was 11. She looked at him for a moment, then turned back to the sink. "That is a considerable thing to take on." "It was just what needed doing," he said. It was the same tone he had used about stepping back at the social. Like the most significant things he had ever done were simply matters of recognizing what was needed, and then doing it without any expectation of recognition. She filed this away alongside everything else. He said his goodbyes to Wilhelm with genuine warmth, shook hands firmly, and walked to where his horse was tied at the post. Lenora came to the door. "Miss Keller," he said, settling into the saddle, "would you do me the honor of a ride on Sunday afternoon? There is a part of the valley I think you would appreciate. The cottonwood groves along Miller Creek before winter strips the leaves." She leaned against the door frame. The wind was moving across the yard, carrying the smell of dry grass and distance. "I would like that," she said. His expression did the same thing it had done at the social, that warmth opening behind the steadiness. "Sunday, then," he said, and turned the horse and rode out the lane, and she watched him go until he was small against the golden hills. Sunday came with a sky so blue it looked painted, the kind of late October day that Kansas occasionally produces like an apology for the winters it is about to deliver. Dexter arrived at 10 in the morning with 2 horses, his own bay gelding and a steady roan mare he had borrowed from his neighbor, Mrs. Tate, specifically because she was reliable and smooth-gaited, and he had thought about whether Lenora would be comfortable. This, Lenora noticed. She noticed the roan was gentle before Dexter said anything about it. She noticed because it meant he had made a plan, and the plan had included her comfort. She had told her father where she was going. Wilhelm had said, "Good," with the brevity of a man who had already made up his mind about something, and was pleased to see the world agreeing with him. They rode south along the fence line and then west toward Miller Creek, where the cottonwood groves stood thick along both banks and the leaves had turned to a particular shade of gold that was not quite yellow and not quite orange, but something between that was entirely its own color. The light came through them like through cathedral glass, and the creek below ran clear and cold over smooth stones. "You were right," Lenora said. They had stopped on a small rise above the grove, and she was looking out at the gold-lit trees with the expression of someone being given a gift they had not expected. "I usually am," he said, and there was enough dry humor in his voice that she turned and looked at him and found him watching her with that steady brown gaze. "That is a confident statement," she said. "I have a very specific definition of usually," he said. She laughed and turned the roan down toward the creek, and he followed, and they rode along the water for an hour, talking about everything and nothing in the easy way of people who have already decided, without explicitly deciding, that they want to keep finding out more about each other. She told him about her younger sisters, Marta and Elise, who were both married now and living in Wichita. She told him about the summer she had spent entirely alone on the farm when her father had to travel to Kansas City on a legal matter regarding the land claim, and how she had managed every aspect of the harvest herself, and how she had been exhausted and proud, and would probably do it again if she had to. She told him about the book of French lessons, and how she had taught herself from it on winter evenings, and how the French she had learned was mostly about trains and hotels, and she had never been on a train or to a hotel. He told her about Texas, about San Antonio's strange, beautiful mix of languages and cultures, about the trail drive north that had nearly killed two of his best hands and one of his best horses, but had brought him to this valley with enough cattle to start something real. He told her about Cal, who had a gift for fixing mechanical things and a corresponding gift for breaking everything else, and who had recently become very interested in a girl named Ada who worked at the dry goods store in town. "Are you happy for him?" Lenora asked. Dexter considered this with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "I am," he said. "Ada Marsh is a good woman, sensible. She has a quality of steadiness that Cal needs. He tends toward enthusiasm and she tends toward logic. I think they will balance each other." "You have thought about this carefully," Lenora said. "He is my brother," Dexter said simply. She looked at him, this very large man on his bay horse in the cathedral light of the cottonwood groves, and felt something move in her chest that she had been careful with for a long time. "What?" he said, noticing her looking. "Nothing," she said. "Tell me about the cattle." He told her about the cattle. He knew his herd with an intimacy that most people reserved for family, which she supposed, in some sense, it was. He talked about the grazing patterns, the way the bluestem grass grew thicker near the creek draws, the particular problems of keeping a herd healthy through a Kansas winter when the north wind came down without manners or mercy. He talked about it with the love of a man who had chosen his work freely and found it worthy of the choosing. When they turned back toward the Keller farm in the early afternoon, the light had shifted to something lower and more golden, and the wind had a cold edge that promised the season was not going to wait much longer. "Mr. Carson," Lenora said, as they rode side by side through the dry grass, "can I ask you something directly?" "You can ask me anything directly," he said. "At the social, the night we met, you did not even know me. Why did you step back?" He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned in their short acquaintance that his silences were not evasions but genuine consideration. "Because you needed the room," he said, "and I had more of it than anyone else in there." "That is a very simple answer." "It is a very simple thing," he said, "but I think maybe you are asking something else." She looked at him. "Maybe I am. You want to know if I saw you before I stepped back, if I noticed you specifically. Did you?" "Yes," he said, without any of the performance that might accompany such an admission. "The moment you came through the door, but that has nothing to do with why I stepped back. I would have done the same for anyone. The reason I am telling you this is because I want you to understand that what happened after talking to you, asking to ride with you, those things are about you specifically. The stepping back was just decency. The rest is something different." Lenora was quiet for a long moment, watching the brown grass move in the wind. "That is a very honest distinction," she said. "I try to be honest," he said. "I have noticed," she said, and then quietly, "I appreciate both things, the decency and the something different." They rode in comfortable silence the rest of the way to the farm, and at the gate he helped her dismount with a hand that was strong and careful, and he held her hand for just a moment longer than the practical situation required before releasing it. "Next Sunday," he said. "Next Sunday," she said. The weeks that followed had a quality of accumulating warmth, like days of sunlight building slowly into something you could actually feel on your skin. Dexter came to the farm on Sundays without fail, and on Thursday evenings he often found a reason to pass by the valley road, and sometimes that reason evolved into stopping for coffee with Wilhelm, who had fully recovered and who was now completing his bridge obligation, and had apparently decided, with the satisfaction of a man who has carefully cultivated a garden, to enjoy what was growing. Cal Carson appeared at the farm one Saturday in November with a fence post pounder and a cheerful expression, and spent the morning helping Lenora reinforce the east fence line, which had been failing since the summer. He was 20 years old and looked enough like his brother that Lenora felt a pang of something complicated the first time she saw him across the yard, the same dark hair, the same steady way of holding himself, But he was also irrepressibly friendly in a way that Dexter was not, the kind of person whose enthusiasm was genuinely contagious. "My brother talks about you," Cal said, not looking up from the post hole. "Does he?" Lenora said. "More than he has talked about anyone," Cal said. Which for Dex is saying something. He is not what you would call an expressive conversationalist most of the time. "I had noticed he is careful with words," Lenora said. "He is careful with everything," Cal said. "It is both his best quality and his most frustrating one. He has been meaning to do something for 2 weeks and keeps coming up with reasons why the timing is not exactly right." "Do something," Lenora repeated. Cal looked up with an expression of someone who had said more than they intended and was now committing fully to the situation. "I am going to let him tell you about that. I should not have said anything. Ada would be disappointed in me." "Tell Ada I appreciated the information," Lenora said. Cal pointed at her and then looked away, grinning, and went back to the post hole. Whatever Dexter had been meaning to do for 2 weeks, he did it the following Sunday. They were walking along the creek bank below the cottonwood groves, which were now stripped of their leaves and stood silver-gray and clean against the cold blue sky. The water was very low, the stones exposed in long pale lines along the banks. The prairie stretched in every direction under that enormous Kansas sky, and the world felt both very large and very contained, just the two of them and the sound of the cold wind and the creek. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. "Lenora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the same direct and steady attention he always had, but there was something in it now that was open in a way she had not seen before, something that made him look younger and more uncertain and therefore, she thought, more like himself than she had ever seen him. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking since the first night we spoke," he said. "And I want to be honest with you the way I try to be honest about everything. I think about you a great deal, and I have tried to be careful about it because I respect you and I respect your father and I did not want to presume. But I am standing here with you and the light is doing that thing it does on the water, and I do not think I can wait for exactly the right moment anymore because I think you might be the right moment." Lenora was quiet for a count of 3. "You think I might be the right moment," she repeated softly. "I mean, you are," he said. He ran a hand through his hair with the unguarded frustration of a man who is accustomed to knowing how to handle things and is not handling this as smoothly as he would like. "You are the right moment. I am not good at this, the talking about it part." "You are doing well," she said. "I would like to court you formally," he said, and looked at her directly again, the uncertainty still present but steady underneath it. "I would like to speak to your father. I would like to be the man who comes to your door on a Sunday and stays for supper and brings you the last of the autumn flowers before the frost takes them and earns the right to call you mine, if you will let me. I am telling you first because I think you should be asked before your father is." The wind moved between them. A kingfisher flashed blue and orange across the surface of the creek. "My father," Lenora said slowly, "has been hoping for this conversation since the 2nd week of November." "Then I am behind schedule," Dexter said. "You are," she said. He looked at her with something building in his expression. "Yes," she said, "formally and properly and with my father's blessing, which I can tell you he is going to give before you finish the first sentence. Yes, Dexter." He took a breath, and the relief in it was enormous and honest, and then the warmth came into his face, that opening she had first seen at the social, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his, the way a person holds something they want to be careful with. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me," she said. "I am getting the better part of this." He shook his head. "We can argue about that," he said, "for a long time." "I expect we will," she said. They walked back along the creek holding hands in the cold November air, and the cottonwood stood silver and patient above them, and the prairie was wide and golden and still. Wilhelm Keller's response to Dexter's formal request, delivered that same evening in the front room of the farmhouse over coffee and cake, was, "I have been waiting 3 weeks for this." "What took so long?" "Caution," Dexter said. Too much caution is its own kind of problem, Wilhelm said. But in a husband I will take it over too little. He extended his hand. You have my blessing, Mr. Carson, and my daughter. You will find that she is not always easy. I know, Dexter said. I find that to be one of her best qualities. Wilhelm looked at him with something that might have been emotion if he had been a man who displayed it, and then shook his hand and said, "Exactly right. You will do." The engagement was announced at the December social, which was smaller than the October one and smelled of pine boughs and wood smoke, and which Pauline Greer attended with the expression of a woman who had planned a military campaign and was watching it succeed. "I knew it," Pauline told anyone who would listen, "from the moment I introduced them." Lenora did not point out that she had introduced herself, or that Pauline's introduction had mainly consisted of pointing. She let the woman have her joy. It was genuine, after all, and there was something lovely about a community that cared about its people enough to celebrate when good things happened. Dexter stood beside Lenora at the December social with a hand resting lightly at the small of her back, and when the room came toward them with congratulations, he did not press in or pull her back. He simply made space and stayed close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, and she leaned into it without thinking, just a degree, just enough. He noticed. She felt his hand press gently at her back in response, brief and warm. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was a hard one. The north winds came down in January with the particular malice that the Kansas plains seemed to save for its coldest months, and the drifts built up along the fence lines in long white walls, and the temperature dropped below what the thermometer at the general store was marked to read. Dexter drove his cattle to the shelter of the creek draws and spent 2 weeks sleeping barely 4 hours a night, checking the herd by lantern light, pulling animals out of drifts, and keeping water liquid in the stock tanks with a determination that left him gaunt-eyed and perpetually cold. He came to the Keller farm when he could, which was not as often as either of them would have liked. When he came, Lenora fed him until the hollowness behind his eyes softened, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table while he reported on the herd and on Cal and on the state of the road, and she told him about the snow coming under the farmhouse door and the woodpile she had managed herself and the letter she had received from Marta in Wichita saying that they were expecting a child. "You will be an aunt," Dexter said. "In May," she said. "I want to go to Wichita when the time comes." "We will go," he said. She looked at him. "We will. You are going to be my wife," he said, as though this were simply a fact and not a thing that still made her heart move strangely in her chest. "What matters to you matters to me." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. His hands were rough and cold from the weeks of outdoor work, and she held them until some of the warmth came back. They were married in April of 1879, on a Saturday morning when the prairie was turning green and the meadowlarks were back from wherever they went in the winter. The ceremony was held at the Caldwell Springs Church, which had fresh flowers on every windowsill courtesy of Mrs. Pauline Greer, who had apparently started on the arrangements sometime in February. Lenora wore a dress that Marta had sent from Wichita, cream-colored lawn with small pearl buttons at the cuffs, the nicest thing Lenora had ever put on her body. She had done her own hair and looked at herself in her mother's hand mirror for a long moment, and thought that she looked like someone who was about to step into a life they had earned. Wilhelm walked her down the aisle of the small church with his hand over hers and his eyes very bright, and did not cry until she was already at the front, which he would later claim was the plan all along. Dexter stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that had been pressed within an inch of its life, and looked at her coming toward him with an expression that she had never seen on his face before. Not the warmth, not the steadiness, but something that was both of those things at once and something larger, something that was entirely and only about her. And she felt her own composure slip just slightly as she reached him and he took her hand. "You are beautiful," he said quietly, before the minister could begin, and the closest pews heard it, and there was a soft collective exhale from the assembled guests. Cal stood beside Dexter as his best man, and appeared to be losing a personal battle with his emotions. Ada Marsh, whom Cal had by this point been courting for 3 months with a seriousness that had surprised everyone including Cal, sat in the second pew and held a handkerchief with the composure of a woman who was storing up practical knowledge for a future occasion. The minister spoke. They made their promises. Dexter's voice was low and certain, each word deliberate and real. Lenora's voice was clear and did not waver. When it was done and the minister said the words, Dexter cupped her face in his large, careful hands and kissed her, and the church broke into noise, and Wilhelm Keller made a sound in his throat that was possibly a sob and definitely was not, and Pauline Greer cried openly and without apology. They left the reception at the community hall at 4 in the afternoon in Dexter's wagon, with the whole town standing outside to see them off, and drove the 6 miles to the Carson Ranch, which was Lenora's home now, in the long golden light of the spring evening with her head against his shoulder, and the prairie wind soft around them. The ranch house was larger than the Keller farmhouse, built solid and square from limestone blocks, with a porch across the front and a good barn and working pens, and 240 acres of the bluestem grass that had called Dexter north from Texas. Lenora had been inside it several times over the winter, and it had always had the feeling of a space that was functional and well kept, but not yet settled into itself. She had thought about this. She had had ideas. They crossed the threshold together, and she stood in the main room and looked around at the limestone walls and the big fireplace and the simple furniture, and felt something click into place inside her the way a key turns in a lock. "Home," she said. "Home," he agreed, and his voice was warm and quiet behind her. And then his arms came around her and she turned in them, and they were there together in the evening light of their own house. And whatever the territory had yet to throw at them, they were going to be solid enough to weather it. The first year of their marriage was a work year, as most first years on a ranch are, but it was also the year that Lenora came to understand the full scope of what Dexter Carson was made of, and he came to understand the same about her. She kept the house with the same capable attention she had always brought to whatever she put her hands to, but she also began to learn the ranch in a way that was more than decorative. She learned the cattle, not in the abstract, but individually, the particular markings of the breeding heifers, the temperament of the bulls, the geography of the grazing patterns Dexter had established over 2 years of close observation. She learned to read the sky for weather in the manner of someone who has a real stake in being right. She kept the accounts, which she had a gift for and which Dexter, who was better with rope and livestock than with ledger columns, was happy to hand over entirely. She planted a kitchen garden in May and a flower bed in June, and the flowers were her one pure extravagance, not practical, not economically justifiable, just beautiful. Dexter never said a word about the cost of the seeds or the time she spent on them. On the morning of their first anniversary, she found that he had built a low fence around the garden with cedar posts and had spent an entire day on it without being asked. She stood looking at the fence for a long moment in the morning light, and then she went back inside and found him at the table with his coffee, and she did not say anything, just put her hands on his shoulders and pressed her cheek to the top of his head. "Good fence," she said. "Good garden," he said. Cal and Ada were married that summer, in June, in a ceremony that was considerably less composed than Dexter and Lenora's. Cal cried openly at the altar, which everyone found both unexpected and endearing, and Ada managed a smile that was very fond and only a little exasperated. They set up house in town, where Cal had secured a partnership with the blacksmith, whose mechanical gifts he shared, and who had recognized in Cal a genuine talent for the work. Lenora and Ada had become friends in the way of women who are not alike but respect each other thoroughly. Ada was precise and logical and somewhat reserved in large company, and Lenora was direct and warm and more comfortable in the world than Ada was, and each of them recognized something useful in the other that they lacked themselves. In October of 1879, Lenora knew she was pregnant. She had known for 3 weeks before she told Dexter, partly because she was very sure and wanted to be absolutely certain, and partly because she was working through her own feelings about it first, the particular mix of joy and solemnity that comes from understanding that something permanent has just been set in motion. She told him on a Sunday evening when Cal and Ada had come for supper and left, and the house was quiet, and they were sitting by the fire. She said it simply and directly, as she said most things. The look on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. The steadiness was still there, the way the frame of a building is still there when you open all the windows, but everything in him opened at once, and he reached for her hand and held it and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "When?" he finally said. "May," she said. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there, and she felt his breath against her knuckles, and then he lowered their joined hands and looked at her with everything that was in him showing plainly on his face. "I am," he said carefully, "the luckiest man in the Kansas Territory. You may feel differently by February," she said, "when I am neither comfortable nor gracious about it." "I will not feel differently," he said. He did not. He was patient through the cold months, attentive without being smothering, careful with the practical things, keeping the house warm, making sure she had everything she needed, taking over the heavier aspects of the farm work without making a production of it. He let her be capable where she was capable and only quietly filled in the gaps. Wilhelm came to stay in April, arriving with his wagon full of preserved goods and his particular quality of calm that had always made Lenora feel that the world was fundamentally manageable. He and Dexter had developed by this point a relationship that was warm and mutual, and based on a shared recognition of what the other was worth. The baby was born on the 14th of May, 1880, early in the morning, when the light was just beginning to show. It was a boy, healthy and emphatic in his opinions from the first breath, with dark hair that curled damply against his head and his father's tendency toward taking up significant space. Dexter Carson held his son for the first time with the same care he brought to everything, the same controlled strength, and looked at the small face with an expression that made Lenora, exhausted as she was, feel something so large she did not have a word in English or German or functional French for it. "Henry," Dexter said. It was the name they had agreed on, Wilhelm's middle name and the name of Dexter's own grandfather, a small bridge between two families that had found each other on the Kansas prairie. "Henry Wilhelm Carson," Lenora confirmed, and closed her eyes and let herself rest. Henry was a robust and sociable child who appeared to have inherited his mother's directness, and his father's calm and his Uncle Cal's enthusiasm, which meant he was generally a force of nature and entirely delightful. Wilhelm stayed for 6 weeks after the birth and spent most of them either holding the baby or sitting on the porch telling Dexter things about crop rotation that Dexter listened to with genuine interest. The town of Caldwell Springs continued to grow around them. 1880 was a busy year in the territory. The cattle trail traffic through town had brought more businesses, and there was talk of a rail line being extended south from Wichita, which would change everything about the economics of ranching in the valley. Dexter went to the community meetings about it and said very little, as was his habit, and thought about it carefully for a long time before telling Lenora his conclusions. "The rail will come," he said, "probably within 3 years. It will make shipping easier and it will drive down the prices the cattle buyers can demand from the trail drivers because there will be more competition. On balance, I think it helps us." "I think so too," Lenora said. She had been reading everything she could find about the rail expansion, which was not as much as she would have liked. "We should consider expanding the herd now, while the trail prices are still where they are, and have the capacity ready when the rail comes." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as meaning he had been thinking the same thing and was pleased to hear it confirmed. "How many head?" he said. Another 60, maybe 80. We have the grass. I was thinking 75, he said. Then we agree, she said. He bought 75 head at the fall auction in Wichita, where he and Lenora drove down with Henry in a basket and stayed 3 days at a boarding house and attended the auction together, which was unusual enough that it attracted some comment and some frank stares. Lenora stood at the rail beside her husband and watched the cattle come through with the attention of someone who had learned what she was looking at. And when Dexter turned to her between lots and asked what she thought of a particular group of steers, she told him, and he bid accordingly, and they ended up with a herd that was everything they had planned for. On the way home from Wichita, driving north through the autumn prairie with Henry asleep between them and the wagon loaded with supplies, Dexter looked at his wife in the late afternoon light and said, "I want to tell you something." "You sound like you are about to say something serious," she said. "I am," he said. "I want to tell you that what we have built, the ranch, the cattle, Henry, it is everything I moved north for, even though I did not know what it was going to be when I came." "But that is not the thing I want to tell you," she waited. "The thing I want to tell you," he said, "is that the ranch and the cattle would be a life. You make it something I did not know I was capable of having, and I am not always good at saying that. But I am saying it now, and I want you to know I mean it, and that I will keep meaning it." The prairie stretched around them in its gold and brown and gray immensity, and the sky above it was an impossible blue, and Lenora looked at this man beside her, this large, careful, honest man who had stepped back in a crowded room because there was a woman who needed space, who had looked at her across a community hall and then across a kitchen table and then across the wide country of a life being built, and had chosen, every day, to be present and real in hers. "I know," she said. "And I want you to know that I see you, not just what you do for us, but you, the man who stepped back before he knew my name, the man who raised his brother, the man who tells me the truth about things even when the truth is complicated. I see you, Dexter Carson, and I would choose you every time." He reached over with one hand and covered hers where it rested on the wagon seat, and they drove the rest of the way home through the long autumn light, and Henry slept peacefully between them, and the land was wide and good. The years that followed built upon each other with the layered solidity of good construction. 1881 brought the rail line, which arrived exactly as Dexter had predicted, and which changed the economics of cattle ranching in the valley in the ways he and Lenora had prepared for. The Carson Ranch shipped its first cattle by rail in October of that year, and the return was better than either of them had projected. Cal and Ada had their first child that year too, a daughter they named Louise, who arrived with Ada's calm blue eyes and Cal's enthusiastic approach to being alive, and who became Henry's closest early companion despite being 18 months younger, since the families spent enough time together that the children grew up as near siblings. Wilhelm Keller's health, which had been reliable after the illness of 1878, began to show its age in the winter of 1881. He was 64 now, still working his farm but more slowly, and Lenora drove out to see him every week without fail, sometimes with Henry in the wagon, sometimes alone. The visits had always been about the particular comfort of being with a parent, but they began to take on an additional quality of time feeling precious. Dexter suggested one evening that autumn that Wilhelm come to live with them. He said it quietly and directly and without preamble, in the way he said things that were important. Lenora looked at him across the supper table, Henry asleep in the next room. "He will not want to leave the farm," she said. "It is everything he built." "I know," Dexter said. "I'm not talking about selling it. I'm talking about leaving it in the care of the Meyerhoff boys next spring and him moving his belongings into the room at the end of the house and being here where you can see him every day." She looked at him for a long moment. "Have you thought about this carefully?" she said. "Since September," he said. "He can be difficult," she said. "He has opinions about how things should be done." "So do I," Dexter said. "We have managed." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I will ask him," she said. She asked him the following Sunday. Wilhelm sat in his kitchen, which was impeccably tidy and had the quality of a space that was maintained but not lived in the way it once had been, and looked at his coffee cup for a long time. "Dexter suggested this," he said. "Yes. I thought so," Wilhelm said. "He is a man who thinks about the right thing to do and then does it without needing to be noticed for it. He was quiet. Very well, after winter." "After winter," Lenora agreed. He moved in the following April, bringing his books and his particular chair and the mirror that had been Berta's and 3 boxes of seeds for the kitchen garden. He took the room at the end of the house and became a fixture of the ranch in a way that suited everyone, including Henry, who attached himself to his grandfather with the complete devotion of a small child for a large person who always has time for them. Lenora watched her father and her son together in the evenings, Wilhelm reading aloud from his German books, while Henry listened with the slightly puzzled attention of a child who does not understand the words but is comforted by the sound. And she felt the particular fullness of a life that has more in it than you planned for and is better for it. She was pregnant again by summer of 1882. This time she told Dexter immediately, sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with Henry eating his porridge beside her. Dexter set down his coffee cup and looked at her with the same unguarded joy as the first time, filtered now through the additional warmth of a man for whom joy of this particular kind had become something familiar and cherished rather than surprising. "January," he guessed. "February," she said. "Closer to right than I expected," he said. Henry looked between them with the attention of a 2-year-old who knows something is happening but cannot identify what. "Baby," Lenora told him. Henry considered this with the gravity of a small philosopher. "Mine," he said. "Yours," she confirmed. Henry apparently found this satisfactory and returned to his porridge. The second child was born in February of 1883 and was another boy, which pleased Henry greatly. They named him Samuel, and he was from the beginning a calmer and more observant child than his brother, prone to watching things for long stretches before acting, with his father's quality of stillness and his mother's gray-green eyes. Wilhelm held Samuel the evening of the birth and sat very quietly with the baby in his arms for a long time, and when he finally spoke, he said in German, "He has your mother's eyes." "I know," Lenora said. She was watching her father hold her son, and the light in the room was soft and warm, and the winter wind was doing its work outside, but the house was solid and warm. "She would have been very pleased," Wilhelm said. "She would have adored Dexter," Lenora said. "She always said she wanted someone large enough to fill up a room for me." Wilhelm made his sound that was not a laugh. "She was a wise woman." "The wisest," Lenora said. Dexter came in from the barn, where he had been giving the family some time, and found his father-in-law with his son and his wife against the lamplight, and stood in the doorway for a moment just looking at all of it. And then he came in and sat down close to Lenora and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him. And the world outside the walls of the Carson Ranch house could do whatever it wanted. The spring of 1883 brought something unexpected. A man named James Pollard rode into Caldwell Springs in April and began asking around about property in the valley with the particular manner of someone who has money and knows it. He was a land speculator from Topeka, and he had gotten wind that the rail line through Caldwell Springs was going to be extended further south, which would make the valley land considerably more valuable, and he intended to buy as much of it as he could before the announcement was made public. The Keller farm, sitting on a route that would be directly affected, was one of the parcels he targeted. The Meyerhoff boys who were farming it were renters, not owners, and so Pollard came to Dexter to discuss the matter, arriving at the ranch unannounced one morning in his good suit and his city hat. Dexter received him on the porch with coffee and listened to his proposal with the patient attention he brought to everything. The offer was generous, more than the farm's current value by a significant margin. Lenora was in the house when the visitor arrived and came to the door when she heard the conversation. She heard the number and her expression did not change. When Pollard had finished speaking, Dexter looked at Lenora in the doorway. This was not a performance. It was simply the way things worked between them. He would not decide about her father's farm without her. "That farm," Lenora said evenly, stepping onto the porch, "was built by my father's hands. He has lived on it for 17 years. The price of it is not negotiable because the answer to selling it is no." Pollard looked at her with the particular surprise of a man who had not expected to be answered by the woman. "Mrs. Carson, with respect, the return on that parcel is not the point," Lenora said. "Good day, Mr. Pollard." Pollard left, not graciously. After his horse was gone down the lane, Dexter looked at Lenora on the porch. "He will be back," he said. "Or someone like him. Then we will say no again," she said. "We will say no again," he agreed. Pollard did come back twice, with increasingly elaborate justifications, and then with thinly veiled pressure tactics, implying that the area farmers who did not sell early would find themselves with diminished land values when the railway interests bought what they needed through other means. Dexter accompanied Lenora to both of those conversations and said very little, but his presence, the sheer physical fact of him standing beside his wife in the conversation, communicated something that was not a threat but was absolutely a statement. The matter resolved itself in the summer of 1883 when the railway extension announcement was made public and several of the community meetings were held. The route, as it turned out, went slightly west of the Keller farm, which meant Pollard's calculations had been wrong. He sold his Topeka business interests 2 years later and left the territory, which the Caldwell Springs Gazette reported in a quarter column, and nobody much mourned. Wilhelm found the entire episode satisfying in a German philosophically way, and said something about land speculators that was probably from Goethe and definitely unprintable. Life on the Carson Ranch continued to build and grow and become itself more fully with each passing year. By 1885, the ranch had 300 head of cattle and a reputation in the valley for quality breeding stock that brought buyers from as far as Dodge City. Lenora managed the accounts with a precision that made their operation more profitable than the neighbors on comparable acreage, and had taken on the additional role of the person people came to in the community when they needed someone to think clearly through a complicated situation. The social events that Caldwell Springs held throughout the year, the community socials, the church harvests, the 4th of July celebrations, were occasions that Lenora attended with Dexter and with the boys, and she moved through them with a warmth and ease that she had always possessed, though she had learned over the years not to minimize what she noticed in other people. At the Harvest Social of 1885, she watched a young woman come through the door of the community hall with a dish in both hands, and saw the familiar press of people converging, and watched the woman's shoulders tighten in the way she remembered very clearly from a different October in a different year. She walked across the room and stood beside the young woman, who was named Cora Dunlap, and had just arrived in the territory with her husband to take up a homestead claim on the north end of the valley. "Let me take that dish," Lenora said, and took it from Cora's hands before the crowd closed in, and turned the group's attention with the ease of a woman who has learned to direct rooms. "Everyone, this is Cora Dunlap. She and her husband have the new homestead at the north end. She has brought—" "What did you make, Cora?" "Apple cake," Cora said, finding her footing. "She has brought apple cake," Lenora announced, "and she has had a long drive, so everyone give her room." The room shifted. Later, when the evening had settled and the dancing was underway, Cora found Lenora by the punch bowl. "Thank you for that," she said. "I do not always do well with crowds." "I know the feeling," Lenora said. "The first time I came to one of these, a large man stepped back from the press and gave me room to breathe, and I have never forgotten it. It is a small thing and it costs nothing, but it matters considerably." "Your husband," Cora guessed. "That is the one," Lenora said, and looked across the room to where Dexter was standing with Henry, now 5 years old and attempting to participate in the adult conversation about cattle prices with the seriousness of someone who had been listening to that conversation since before he could walk. Dexter looked up and found her across the room, and the warmth came into his face, that particular opening she had loved since the first time she saw it. She smiled back. Cora Dunlap, watching this exchange, said, "Oh, yes," Lenora said. "Exactly." The years continued to pass with the quality of good years, which is to say they were full and demanding and real. 1886 was a drought year, and the Carson Ranch tightened its belt and managed the herd through it with careful planning, selling early where they had to, maintaining the core breeding stock, using the stored hay Lenora had insisted they put up in excess the previous fall, which Dexter had not argued about because he had learned that her instincts about preparation were sound. Wilhelm Keller turned 70 in the spring of 1887. They celebrated it with a dinner that included Cal and Ada and their 2 children, Louise, now 6, and a new son they had named George, and the whole gathering of the extended family filled the Carson Ranch house with noise and warmth, and Wilhelm sat at the head of the table with Henry on one side and Samuel on the other, and looked around at everything with the expression of a man who is fully satisfied with where things have come to. After the celebration, when the children were in bed and Cal and Ada had driven back to town, Lenora sat with her father on the porch in the soft spring dark. "Are you happy here?" she said. "Truly." He was quiet for a moment in his considered way. "I am," he said. "I was not sure I would be when I came. I thought I would feel like a guest, but Dexter made it very clear from the beginning that this was my home and not just my daughter's husband's house." "He is like that," Lenora said. "He is," Wilhelm agreed. "He is the kind of man who does not need the credit for the things he does right, which is the rarest kind." Lenora looked out at the prairie dark, the stars enormous above the flat land. "I think about the social," she said. "The first night I met him, the way he just stepped back, he did not know me, he did not know anything about me, he just saw that I needed room and he gave it." "And you knew," Wilhelm said. "Not right then," she said, "but I remembered it, I kept coming back to it. A man who would do that just because it was the right thing with no one watching and no reason to expect anything back. I kept thinking about what that meant about who he was." "It means exactly what you thought it meant," Wilhelm said. "Yes," she said, "it does." Dexter came out onto the porch then, having put Henry back to bed for the 3rd time, and settled into the chair beside Lenora with the slightly weary air of a man who has been outmaneuvered by a 5-year-old for the better part of an hour. "Asleep?" Lenora said. "Finally," he said. He wanted to know if cattle dream. "Do they?" Wilhelm said. "I have no idea," Dexter said. I told him probably yes, which seems like the kinder answer. Wilhelm made his sound that was not quite a laugh and pushed himself up from his chair. "Good night," he said. "Thank you for my birthday." "Happy birthday, Father," Lenora said, and he patted her shoulder and went inside. Lenora and Dexter sat on the porch in the spring dark after he was gone, the way they had sat on this porch through 7 years of seasons, the kind of comfortable silence that is its own form of conversation. "He seems well," Dexter said. "He is," she said. "I think he is happy here." "Good," he said simply. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The meadowlarks were calling somewhere in the dark grass, and the prairie was enormous and dark and full of stars. "Henry wants to know if he can ride with you during the summer roundup," she said. "He is 5, Dexter said. "I told him that. He said you started working cattle young." "I started working cattle at 7 and it nearly killed me several times," Dexter said. "He can come for the morning portion and go back to the house at noon." "He will negotiate for all day," she said. "He gets that from you," he said. "He gets the negotiating from me," she said. "The stubbornness he gets from you." "We do not need to assign all the qualities," he said, and she felt the smile in his voice against her hair. She tilted her head back and looked at him in the dark. "I love you," she said. It was something she said often and meant every time, but there were moments when it carried additional weight, when it came from a place deeper than habit and fuller than routine. He looked at her with everything open in his face. "I love you," he said. "Every year I think I understand what that means, and every year I find out there is more of it." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. "There is always more of it," she said. He turned his face into her hand and held there for a moment, and the spring night went on around them, patient and large, and full of whatever good things the years were still bringing. Henry did accompany his father for the morning portion of the summer roundup, and he came back to the ranch house at noon every day for 3 days, walking with the deliberate bow-legged pride of a small boy who has been on horseback with the men and knows it. And Lenora fed him and cleaned him, and listened to every word of his reports with the same attention his father gave everything. On the 4th day she rode out herself, leaving Samuel with Wilhelm, and worked the afternoon alongside Dexter and the 2 ranch hands they employed now, Gideon and Pete, who were both competent and decent, and who had absorbed without apparent difficulty the fact that the rancher's wife was as comfortable in the working pens as the rancher himself. She caught Henry watching her work the cattle with an expression that she read without difficulty, something being settled into place in his understanding of who his mother was and what the word woman meant. She did not point it out to him. She just kept working. In the autumn of 1887, Lenora discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time. She was 33 years old, and she and Dexter had not been planning it, but when she told him again at the kitchen table, which had become the location of all their most significant conversations, he looked at her with joy that was immediate and complete and entirely free of complication. "Boy or girl, we are lucky," he said. "We are always lucky," she said. "Not always," he said, "but we have been careful with the luck we have." "That is true," she said. The baby was a girl, born in April of 1888 when the spring was coming in warm and fast, and they named her Clara Berta Carson, the middle name for Lenora's mother. She had dark curling hair, and from the very beginning a personality of great personal certainty and warmth. And Henry, who was 8 years old and had wanted a sister with a conviction he could not entirely explain, was so entirely devoted to her from the first moment that Lenora had to institute a system by which he was not allowed to hold her for more than an hour at a time so that she could actually sleep. Samuel, 5 years old and philosophically about the universe, accepted Clara's arrival with his usual quality of calm observation, and then began to include her in his long surveys of the world around him, holding her up at the window to look at things outside with an explanatory patience well beyond his years. The family settled around this new addition the way a group of people settle around a fire, naturally finding the configuration that works. Wilhelm read to Clara even before she could understand the words. Dexter held her in the evenings with the same contained, careful strength he had held every other precious thing in his life. Caldwell Springs had grown considerably by 1888. There were nearly 1,200 people in the town and surrounding area now, and the rail line had brought businesses and ambitions and complications. There was a proper school with 2 rooms and a dedicated teacher, Miss Eleanor Voss, who was young and excellently trained, and who looked out at her territory with the expression of someone who has come to do something and intends to do it. Henry started school in the fall of 1888. Lenora had been teaching him to read since he was 4, and he arrived in the first reader class already capable of reading at a second reader level, which Miss Voss noted in her records with appreciation, and then adjusted her program accordingly. Lenora walked him to school on the first morning. It was a 2-mile ride in the wagon, and watched him go through the door of the schoolhouse with his slate board under his arm and his particular version of his father's walk, deliberate and unhurried, and felt the particular pride and particular loss of a parent watching a child enter the larger world. She told Dexter about it that evening. He listened. "He will do well," he said. "He will," she agreed. "He is stubborn and curious, and he has your quality of paying attention, and your quality of not being deterred," he said. "He has the best of both of us," she said, "which is both a relief and a terror if I am honest." "I know exactly what you mean," he said. The years of the late 1880s and into the 1890s continued to build the life of the Carson Ranch and the family that inhabited it. The cattle operation expanded and contracted with the rhythms of the market, and the weather, never catastrophically, always manageably, because Dexter and Lenora ran it with the combination of his practical knowledge and her financial clarity that made for better decisions than either would have made alone. Clara grew into a child of great personal force and warmth, who seemed to know everyone in the valley and remember everything about them. She had a gift for making people feel seen that her mother recognized with a particular fondness. Henry became the kind of young man who carried his father's physical size and his mother's directness, and who worked the ranch with a quiet competence that made Dexter's chest tight with something he never quite found the words for. Samuel, the middle child, developed an unusual mind for numbers and patterns, and began helping his mother with the accounts at age 10, in a way that moved from assistance to partnership within a year. Wilhelm Keller died in the winter of 1892, peacefully, and in his own bed in the room at the end of the Carson Ranch house, with Lenora's hand in his. He was 75 years old. He had lived long enough to see all three of his grandchildren, long enough to know that his daughter was well loved and well situated, and that the wheat farm he had built would be maintained with care. He died in German, which was the language he had always thought in, and the last clear thing he said was his wife Berta's name. The grief of it was real and it was large, but it was not the kind of grief that breaks things. It was the kind that makes you feel the weight of love, how much there must have been to produce this much absence. Dexter let her grieve at her own pace and in her own way, and he was present for all of it without pressing or managing or trying to make it smaller than it was. She found him one evening in the barn, 2 weeks after the funeral, standing quietly with his hand on the neck of his old bay gelding, now retired to a peaceful old age in the near pasture. He was looking out the barn door at the winter prairie with an expression she recognized as not entirely his own grief. It was held partly on behalf of her. She went and stood beside him and put her arm around him. "Thank you," she said, "for the last years, for having him here." "He was mine too," Dexter said. "By the time he died, he was mine too." She pressed her face against his arm and stood there in the cold barn while the wind moved outside, and he held her with the particular steadiness that had been his since the beginning, the quality that she had first understood when he stepped back in a crowded room and gave a stranger space to breathe. Life continued. Henry was 13 in 1893, and already half a head taller than most boys his age, with the build coming in that would eventually make him as large as his father. He was working the cattle seriously now, not as a child's participation but as a genuine hand, and Dexter taught him with a patience and thoroughness that Lenora watched with quiet admiration. Samuel, 10 years old, had asked for additional books from the school library that winter and was working through everything available with a systematic dedication that amused and impressed Miss Voss, who was still teaching at the school, now married to the local physician, Dr. Fenton Voss, and who had become one of Lenora's genuinely trusted friends. Clara, 5 years old, had opinions about everything and the confidence to express them, and the entire valley of Caldwell Springs had accepted this as simply a fact about the youngest Carson child. Cal and Ada had expanded to 3 children by now, with a second son born in 1891, whom they named Robert. Cal's blacksmith business had grown into a full forge and machine repair shop, which was increasingly necessary as the farmers in the valley acquired more mechanical equipment, and he had hired 2 assistants and was doing very well. Ada managed the books for the business and the household with the same precision she brought to everything, and was beginning to be consulted informally on financial matters by other businesses in town, a fact that she accepted with her characteristic composure. The social of October 1893, 15 years from the night Lenora and Dexter had met, was a large one, held in the expanded community hall that had been built the previous year to accommodate the growing town. There were new families, new faces, the continuing role of people arriving in the territory to build something from the available land and possibility. Dexter and Lenora arrived together, as they always did, with Henry and Samuel and Clara in tow. Lenora was wearing a deep green wool dress that was well made and suited her in a way that the blue calico of her first social could not have anticipated, and she was 39 years old and knew who she was and moved through the room accordingly. Dexter had his hand at the small of her back as they entered, still light, still respectful, still exactly what the situation called for and nothing performed about it, and she felt the familiar warmth of it and thought, as she had thought many times, that there are people who move through their lives never finding this, the person beside whom they are most entirely themselves. The hall was crowded and bright with lamplight, and the noise of the community coming together after the harvest. Lenora watched the door for a while, the way she had gotten into the habit of doing. A woman came in with a dish, hands full, and the press of people moved toward her in the familiar way. Lenora was already stepping forward to help when she saw Henry, her 13-year-old son, do something that made her stop entirely. He stepped back. He was standing near the door with a group of boys his age, and he saw the situation, and without saying anything or making any announcement, he took a step back and turned to the boy beside him and said something quietly, and that boy stepped back too, and the crowd opened slightly. Not dramatically, not for recognition. Just because there was a woman who needed room, and he had some to give. Lenora stood perfectly still in the middle of the Caldwell Springs Community Hall and felt something move through her that she could not entirely account for: joy and grief and gratitude all together, the feeling of watching something that matters be passed forward. She turned and found Dexter beside her, because he was always beside her, and he had seen it too. She could tell from the particular quality of his expression, the warmth and the steadiness combined, that he had been watching his son at the door. "He did not even think about it," Lenora said quietly. "No," Dexter said, "he did not. He learned that from you. He learned it from watching," Dexter said. "Which is the only real way." She looked at him. "You know," she said, "the night I walked in here, this very hall, 15 years ago, with a dish in my hands and every man in the room pressing forward, and you stepped back, I thought at the time that it was the kindest small thing I had ever seen a stranger do." "It was not remarkable," he said. "You always say that," she said. "I disagree every time." "I know," he said. "You are very consistent." "I am," she said. "And here is what I have decided, 15 years on. It was not small. It was the whole shape of you in one gesture. It was every good thing about you in the simplest possible form. And I saw it, and I did not forget it, and I would not trade a single year of what came after it for anything in the world." He looked at her with everything in him open and present. "You have a remarkable memory," he said, which was his way when words were insufficient and the feelings were too large for the room. "I have a remarkable husband," she said. He took her hand. Across the hall, Henry was laughing with the other boys now. The moment of quiet decency already passed, and simply part of who he was. Samuel was somewhere near the refreshment table, probably reading the hand-lettered menu someone had put out as decoration. Clara had already found 3 other children and was organizing them with cheerful authority. Dexter Carson stood in the crowded hall with his wife's hand in his, and the community of their life moving all around them, and he was the largest man in the room, and he was entirely, wholly, exactly where he was supposed to be. The supper that followed the social was held at tables arranged along the walls, and the Carson family sat together with Cal and Ada and their children, and the food was the accumulated work of 100 households, and it was good. The fiddle players, the Wilson boys, now middle-aged and somewhat improved, played through the supper, and then into the dancing, and the community of Caldwell Springs turned in the lamplight the way communities do when they are, in the main, content. Dexter danced with Lenora to the Virginia reel, the same dance they had danced 15 years before, and he was still careful and still deliberate and still moved with more grace than his size suggested. and she still had sturdy boots, though she had never once needed them. He danced with Clara too, his 5-year-old daughter, who stood on his feet and held his hands and looked up at the distance to his face with an expression of complete confidence in the man above her. Henry danced with Ada, because Cal had taught him that dancing with family was more important than looking too dignified to dance. Samuel watched the fiddle players with the intense focus of someone working out the mechanics of how the sound was made. When the evening was ending and the lanterns were being turned down, Lenora stood outside in the October night under the same enormous Kansas sky as 15 years before, and beside her was the same man who had been watching to make sure she reached the road safely before he ever knew her name. Henry came out with Clara on his back, the little girl's arms around his neck and her head already drooping with sleep, and he walked carefully to the wagon with her and settled her inside with a competence and gentleness that made Dexter reach out without thinking and put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Henry looked up. "She fell asleep during the last song," he said. "I saw," Dexter said. "She made me dance with her 4 times before that," Henry said. "She counts." "She gets that from your mother," Dexter said. Lenora, who had heard all of this, said nothing. She climbed into the wagon and arranged the sleeping Clara more comfortably, and Samuel climbed in behind, and Dexter took the reins with Henry beside him on the bench. They drove home through the October night under the cathedral of stars, the prairie dark and wide in every direction, the lights of Caldwell Springs disappearing behind them as they turned onto the valley road. The horses knew the way. The children settled into sleep one by one. The night was cold and clear and very still. "You know what I was thinking about tonight," Lenora said quietly so as not to wake the children. "Tell me," Dexter said, "the first night, and how I almost did not come. My father was sick and I thought I should stay, and he practically pushed me out the door. He said he would be perfectly all right for one evening and that I was 24 years old and needed to get out of the house." "Smart man," Dexter said. "The smartest," she said. "And I walked in with that dish and the whole room came at me and I felt like the air had been pressed out. And then the room shifted, and I set down the dish and turned around to find the person who had done it. And found me talking to Harlan Briggs about grain prices," he said. "You were not even looking at me," she said. "You had just done it and moved on. It did not require my continued attention," he said. "And that was the thing," she said. "That was the thing I could not stop thinking about, the decency that asks nothing back. I have thought about it 1,000 times in 15 years. He was quiet for a moment, the horses moving steady through the dark. "I think about the moment you came through that door," he said. "Every time I think about how things might have been. You with your dish and your blue dress and your eyes that I could not quite name the color of. What color are they?" She said. She had asked him this before across the years as a kind of ongoing question. He considered it with the seriousness he always brought to it. "Creek water on a cloudy day," he said, as he always said. "Not quite green, not quite gray, honest." She looked at him. "That is your favorite answer," she said. "Because it is the true one," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he adjusted the reins to one hand and put his arm around her. And they drove the rest of the way home through the cold, beautiful night, their children asleep behind them, the prairie enormous and patient and full of stars. The Carson ranch house was warm when they arrived, the banked fire in the kitchen still holding heat. Dexter carried Clara to her bed, and Henry managed himself, and Samuel went quietly, and the house settled into sleep while Lenora sat in the kitchen in her green dress and poured herself the last of the evening's coffee and looked at the space around her. The limestone walls and the good fireplace, and the flower that Henry had brought her last week now dried on the windowsill, and the ledger open on the desk where she had left it, and the books that lined the shelf that had started with her father's Goethe and grown through 15 years into a proper collection. Dexter came back from the children's rooms and sat across from her at the kitchen table in his chair in their house in the life they had built. "Coffee," she said. "Please," he said. She poured it and set it in front of him and sat back down, and they were quiet together in the warm kitchen in the way of people who have been quiet together 1,000 times and find it as comfortable as conversation. "I have been thinking," she said. "What about the North Pasture? The Meyerhoffs have been talking about leaving the Keller farm at the end of this season, going to Colorado." "I heard," he said. "I think we should take the farm back ourselves," she said, "not rent it out again. Henry is old enough to take some real responsibility, and between him and Gideon we could run the wheat operation in addition to the cattle. The rotation would be good for the soil, and the income would be more reliable year to year than cattle alone." He was looking at her with the focused attention he brought to serious propositions. "And," she said, "it would be something real for Henry to have his name on. Not just work on, but have responsibility for. He is going to need that. He is the kind of person who needs to be building something." Dexter was quiet for a moment. "He is," he said. "He is like you in that way," she said. "He is like both of us," Dexter said. "He wants to be responsible for something, and he wants to do it well, and he does not need applause for it." "No," Lenora said. "He just needs the thing to take care of." They talked about the logistics and the numbers which Lenora had already worked through roughly in the margins of the ledger, and by the time the coffee was gone and the fire had banked lower, they had made a plan that felt solid and right, the way their plans generally did when they made them together. Dexter cleared the cups and set them by the sink, and Lenora blew out the lamp on the table, and they moved through their house in the dark the way they had done for years, easy and familiar and quiet. In their room in the dark, Dexter said, "Lenora, yes, I want to say something." "You often do at this hour," she said, and he heard the smile in her voice. "I want to say," he said, "that 15 years is not a long time, and I want a lot more of them." She was quiet for a moment. "So do I," she said. "And when they are done," he said, "whenever that is, I want to have used all of them. I do not want to have been careful about the living part." "You have not been careful about the living part," she said. "You have been careful about the people. That is different." "Yes," he said. "Yes, that is exactly right." The dark room was very quiet. Outside, the prairie wind moved across the grass in its ancient patient way, the way it had moved before any of them were there and would move long after. "Go to sleep, Dexter," she said gently. "Good night, Lenora," he said. They slept. The spring of 1894 came in with warmth and rain in the right proportions, which in Kansas is not something you take for granted. The Keller farm transitioned into Carson management with less difficulty than anticipated, partly because Henry took to the responsibility the way Lenora had predicted, with competence and quiet pride, and a work ethic that started before dawn and did not argue with the quality of itself. He was 14 now and big for his age and serious about the work in a way that made the neighbors nod to each other and say the older Carson boy was going to be something, which Lenora thought was beside the point because he already was something, but she understood that people needed to observe a thing for a while before they named it. The wheat that first season was good. They put it up carefully, and Lenora kept the numbers with precision, and the result at the end of the season was solid income and confirmed soil health in Henry, who came in from the last day of harvest with his hands blistered and his face wind-burned and an expression of very deep satisfaction. "Good?" Dexter asked him. "Good," Henry said. That was, Lenora reflected, one of the things she loved most about the men in her life, how much they could say with very few words when the words were honest. Clara began school in the fall of 1894 and was a social force within the first week. She knew everyone's name by the third day. By the second week, she had organized a game that the entire schoolyard was playing and had mediated 2 disputes with the calm authority of a much older person. Miss Voss, Dr. Voss's wife, teaching still because she loved it and because she was excellent at it, wrote a note home that said simply, "Clara is remarkable. Please let her direct things occasionally. She is very good at it." Samuel, at 11, had begun a correspondence with a professor at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, through the entirely improper but entirely productive channel of Miss Voss, writing a letter on his behalf, after reading his response to an arithmetic problem that she said was better than anything she had seen from a student twice his age. The professor, a Dr. Archibald Moore, had written back with interest and had sent several more problems of increasing difficulty. Samuel was working through them in the evenings, with the focused pleasure of a person doing exactly what they were made to do. Lenora read his solutions over his shoulder sometimes and understood approximately a third of what she was seeing, which she considered an adequate position from which to be impressed. "What does this part mean?" she asked one evening, pointing to a line of figures. Samuel explained it with a patience that was entirely unpatronizing and that she appreciated enormously. "You are going to go to university," she said. "I hope so," he said. "You will," she said. "We will find a way." He looked at her with the particular gray-green eyes that had come from her mother and had landed in him. "You and father," he said. "Always," she said. By the time the autumn social of 1895 arrived, the community hall once again full and bright with lamplight, and the fiddle players tuning up, Lenora Carson was 41 years old and entirely herself, which is to say more fully herself than she had been at 24. The way a person becomes more precisely who they are as the years do their work. She sat near the wall with Ada and watched the room with the pleasure of a woman who likes people and has learned to read them well. Dexter was across the room talking to a group of ranchers about range management, using more words than he used in most conversations, which meant he was genuinely engaged with the topic. Henry was somewhere near the back of the hall, having recently developed the social habits appropriate to a 15-year-old who had noticed that girls exist. Samuel was near the door, characteristically observing the social dynamics of the room with the expression of someone compiling data. Clara was dancing, despite the fact that the dancing had not officially started. "Are you happy?" Ada asked. Lenora looked at her, a little surprised by the directness. "Very," she said. "Are you?" "Very," Ada said. "I thought about this the other day, whether I would change anything." "And," Lenora said. "Nothing," Ada said, which surprised me. "I generally have opinions about how things could be improved." "You do," Lenora agreed fondly. "But the large things," Ada said. "No, I would not change the large things." Lenora looked at her husband across the room. He chose that moment, as he sometimes did with a frequency that she had stopped trying to rationalize, to look up and find her across the space between them. She lifted her chin slightly, the small private signal they had developed across years of crowded rooms. "I see you." His expression did the thing it did. "I see you too." "No," Lenora said. "I would not change the large things either." She thought of the first night, and the dish in her hands, and the press of the crowd, and the shift in the room, and the large man who had stepped back and given her space to breathe. She thought of the cottonwood groves in October, and the creek running clear over cold stones, and his voice saying her name for the first time. She thought of every Sunday morning and every winter evening and every child and every season and every conversation across their kitchen table. She thought of her father reading in German in the room at the end of the house, and of her children growing into the people they were becoming, and of this man across the room who had told her once that she was the right moment. She was 41 years old, and the Prairie was enormous, and the community was warm, and the fiddle players were beginning to play, and Dexter was crossing the room toward her with his hat in his hands and his expression open and sure. "Dance with me," he said when he reached her. "I thought you would never ask," she said. He took her hand and they moved onto the floor that they had first shared 17 years ago, the same boards, the same hall, the same community gathered around them, and they danced. He was still careful. She still had sturdy boots. He still moved with more grace than his size suggested, and she still fit against him in the pattern of the dance with the ease of long practice and something deeper than practice. Around them, the community of Caldwell Springs turned in the lamplight, and Henry was somewhere in it, and Samuel was watching the musicians now with that focused intent, and Clara was dancing with a little girl she had just met and would remember forever, and the fiddles sang out into the Kansas night, and the prairie was wide and good and full of stars, and Lenora and Dexter Carson danced until the lights went down, and then they went home to the life they had built, and it was everything.